Hello, everyone. I just wanted to share my thoughts on our reading, as usual. This is on pages 81 and 80, 80 and 81 in the chapter called How to Tame a Wild Tongue, which has many remarkable things in it, but I was most struck by this section that Ansel Dua calls linguistic terrorism, which is really, for me, as a monolingual American only speaking English, it's really quite an education. I mean, and in some ways it's familiar, in some ways it's absolutely unfamiliar to me. And she's talking about her language, which is, what would you call it? Chicana or Chicano Spanish. And she's already talked about the different languages that she speaks, that she grew up not only bilingual, speaking Spanish and English, but there are all sorts of other sort of sub languages within those general headings that she's familiar with. And Chicano or Chicano Spanish is a language of her region, the borderland region, the region where people, um, are speaking some version of Spanish, but heavily influenced by English too, because that's language is also spoken where they grow up. So the interesting part of it is not so much that she's got these different languages at her command. The interesting part of it is the politics of it, and the way that language becomes a signifier of social differences. Really amazing thing where she says here, Chicana feminists often skirt around each other with suspicion and hesitation. For the longest time, I couldn't figure it out. Then it dawned on me. To be close to another Chicana is like looking into the mirror. We are afraid of what we'll see there. Pena, shame, low estimation of self. In childhood, we are told that our language is wrong. I mean, wrong because it's not, the prejudice there, I suppose, really is not from English speakers or it's from other Spanish speakers saying your language is wrong because it incorporates different things from English. So really, the prejudice is from people from Mexico, Latin America, Spain, I guess, who speak a different version of Spanish, which they consider to be true Spanish, whereas the kind of Chicano Spanish is like low class or call it a bastard language, language without parents, right? Low estimate. In childhood, we are told that our language is wrong. Repeated attacks on our native tongue diminish our sense of self. The attacks continue throughout our lives. So this is really, I mean, very interesting, right? The idea that you have this consciousness that the way you speak somehow is defective, and that this is not just the way you speak, but because the way we speak our language is so definitive of who we are as individuals that this defectiveness somehow is your own self. Really extremely interesting. You know, and she says Chicanas, people from her region speak her version of Spanish, feel uncomfortable talking in Spanish to Latinas, right? Because those Latinas, she says, they had a whole lifetime of being immersed in their native tongue, whereas Chicanas are constantly surrounded by an English-speaking culture and made to feel that them speaking Spanish is somehow bad or alienates them for us, the culture. I mean, the people from Spanish-speaking countries don't have this. Um, yeah, to the point where she says that, yeah, she's talking about really being an academic, right? So going to conferences and stuff. She says, even among Chicanas, we tend to speak English at parties or conferences, right? So people who could speak to each other in Chicano English don't. They speak to each other in English just to avoid these sort of issues having to do with Chicano English. Really, really something. But she's pointing out that this is crazy, right? That this is a sign of trauma, really, and a kind of being a victim of a kind of prejudice and oppression. That they avoid their own language, even with each other. We oppress each other. Oh yeah. Well, then she says. Then there's another thing where they try to out Chicano each other to be real Chicana. So it's just so incredibly complex. This linguistic situation that she's in. Um, that I mean, I can't believe it, right? I mean, I can believe it. I just can't. I can't relate, I guess, because I've never been in a situation myself where my language and the way I speak it and the way that my community speaks it somehow is called into doubt. I mean, there is, at a certain level, a question of American English as opposed to other Englishes, English spoken around the world, especially in England. I mean, English people of a certain type love to make fun of the American accent, and there's a general prejudice against the American accent there. I mean, which is an interesting subject, but it's more of an annoyance or something funny, I think, to an American, a typical American. I mean, we laugh at it because it's just not an issue, really. This, for her, this is a deep issue, you know, where her language is disrespected, but that means that she's disrespected. And so she ends this passage um, saying, "So if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language," which is pretty amazing. I mean, I don't know if we all feel that way, that we are our languages. Um, in a certain sense, it's obvious that we are. But for her, I think it's a stronger thing than the typical sort of person, and a person who doesn't live in a borderlands, you know, where language is so fraught with history, politics, oppression, violence, that her language is so deeply a part of who she is. So that if you downgrade her language, if you degrade her language, you're degrading her. Really, really amazing. And so she gives an explanation here, which I didn't realize until I read this passage. Why so much of this book is untranslated from, I'm supposing, Chicano Spanish, but it may be from the other versions that she speaks. But so much of this book is untranslated into English, which is pretty courageous considering that, writing a book where many, if not most, of your readers won't be able to actually read parts of it. That's pretty courageous, but she's sticking to her beliefs here. I mean, listen to what she says. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicano, Texas, Spanish, Tex Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself. And here's the kicker, right? She says, until I am free to write bilingually and to switch codes without having always to translate, while I still have to speak English or Spanish when I would rather speak Spanglish. And as long as I have to accommodate the English speakers rather than having them accommodate me, my tongue will be illegitimate. So what we find out is that she couldn't have written this book in anything but a mixture of the different languages that she speaks. That is, if she were to say, if I'm sure, I mean, I'm not sure, but if an editor at her publisher had said, listen, it would be your book would do a lot better if you would translate everything into English, um, she would have to refuse because that would be bowing to the very cultural pressures that she's saying she has to resist. So, really, I would say remarkable account here of her experience with language, but also maybe gives us an insight into broader issues having to do with language and politics.